6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people for whom for 6 years and 1 day there was hell on earth. Basking in early success, the Japanese described themselves as being victory drunk, and Admiral Mitomi Ugaki declared on New Year's Day, 1942,
"The main thing is to win, and we surely will win."
But on May 12th, little over 4 months later, and following the Battle of the Coral Sea, Admiral Ugaki struck a different note in his diary.
A dream of great success has been shattered.
The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, was a shock, but not quite a surprise. In China, many considered it a blessing, but China's war was far from over.
When we think about the experience that we associate with the war in the West, even something as iconic as the Blitz in London, we should remember that those experiences were not just shared in China, but often the Chinese were there first.
The news of Pearl Harbor was also greeted with glee by the British Prime Minister, who was spending that weekend at his official country home.
When the news of Pearl Harbor came through, he said he went to bed that evening and he slept the sleep of the just and the saved, because he knew that America coming into the war in that way would tip the balance completely against Nazi Germany.
Four days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler announced to the Reichstag that Germany had declared war on the USA. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, asked,
"When has a Jewified nation like that ever produced fighters?"
Hitler said,
"Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it's half Judaized and the other half negrified. How can one expect a state like that to hold together?"
The American president spoke to the American people and to the world in his State of the Union address on January 6th.
In fulfilling my duty to report upon the State of the Union, I am proud to say to you that the spirit of the American people was never higher than it is today.
Hitler thought that even if America came into the war, it would be so preoccupied with the Pacific and with Japan, it would have little time and energy and resource to apply to Europe. It's totally the other way when it comes to it. Roosevelt commits its forces first to the European war. It is a remarkable thing.
In the address, Roosevelt told the world that the United States would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 42, and 75,000 in 43.
This will give Japanese and the Nazis a little idea of just what they accomplished in the attack at Pearl Harbor.
I suppose you could say that Roosevelt had charisma. He had this ability to speak to people. But I think what made him different from people like Hitler or Mussolini was that he believed in democratic institutions. He always accepted that he worked within the bounds of the American Constitution.
The president was determined that the production figures in his Union address would be achieved or bettered. He sent for a businessman, Donald Nelson, executive vice president of Sears Roebuck. Roosevelt set up a new authority, the War Production Board. He asked the man from Sears Roebuck if he approved of the name. Nelson said it was fine. Roosevelt said,
I'm glad you approve, because you are the chairman of the War Production Board.
Donald Nelson powered up an industrial base, which was already dominant.
In the time the Japanese built one aircraft carrier, the Americans built 24. There is no way that they could match that. In modern warfare, it's all about manufacturing ability and logistics, and the Americans could overwhelm the Japanese.
Americans are preparing with all possible speed to take their places. Workers in the mills and the mines are laboring long hours under great pressure to turn out the weapons and the equipment without which the war cannot be won.
Once Donald Nelson went to work, the transformation was extraordinary. In 1941, American dockyards produced 794,000 tons of shipping. In the following 3 years, they produced 21 million tons. In 1940, the United States of America produced 2,141 aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,318. By 1943, 18 American shipyards were together producing 3 14,000-ton cargo vessels every day.
America is determined to build enough ships fast enough.
And those living near the shipyards knew as well as anyone that there was a war on.
Work never stopped on the ships. Early or late, it was possible to hear the roar of construction 5 miles from the shipyard.
American industrial output was said to be a tank every 5 minutes, an aircraft every half hour, and an aircraft carrier every week. But the threat to America was not on her Pacific, but on her Atlantic seaboard. In January 1942, German U-boats sank 132 ships between New York and Miami. The Germans called it Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, nicknamed the Second Happy Time. The first happy time had initiated the war's longest battle, the Battle of the Atlantic. In March 1941, the First Lord of the Admiralty said,
"We must impress upon both employers and workers that in facing the Battle of the Atlantic, now opening upon us, we need every ounce of their energy and ever-increasing production."
Britain's natural defense as an island may have saved her from invasion, but it was also a liability. The strength of her navy, the size of her merchant marine, almost 1/3 of the world's merchant tonnage was British, and the bounty of her empire, 42% of imports came on long voyages from imperial ports, had made Britain dependent on imports. Not for comfort, but for survival. Winston Churchill admitted,
The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Invasion, I thought, even before the air battle, would fail. But now, our lifeline, even across the broad oceans, and especially in the entrances to the island, was endangered.
Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded the U-boats, but not in the numbers he thought necessary. It was 1942 before Hitler conceded that
The submarine will in the end decide the outcome of the war.
the fall of France brought the German U-boat fleet closer to the Atlantic shipping lanes through possession of French ports. From July 1940 to the end of October, 282 Allied ships were sunk, a loss of 1,489,795 tons of merchant shipping. When a ship was hit, getting the lifeboats away was an epic endeavor, recalled with emotion by those who witnessed it.
The wind shrieked through the rigging and superstructure. I caught a glimpse of one of the big merchant ships being rolled on its beam ends by the huge swells.
The boat was lowered somehow, and we scrambled down towards it. "Cast off!" bawled someone when the boat seemed crowded, but answered at once by yells and screams above us. "No, no, wait a second!"
We owe a debt that can never be paid to the merchant navy. We believe the vast majority of the people of this country realize what they owe to our seamen.
The Battle of the Atlantic would claim about 100,000 lives, shared almost equally between those serving in Allied navies, merchant sailors, and the U-boat crews. Tactics and weapons evolved as the battle continued. For the Allies, the most important innovation was the convoy system, but it had its limitations.
A convoy system reduces the efficiency of shipping because you have to wait for enough ships to be assembled. They move from point A to point B at the speed of the slowest. Nevertheless, by bringing the ships together, it forced the U-boats to face the defenders in order to get at the targets.
The Germans have tried hard to beat the convoy system, but they have failed. As in the last war, so in this, the convoy system has proved its efficiency.
Tactics improved, but according to a U-boat captain, nothing improved life aboard the U-boats.
All are living under constant tension produced by living in a steel tube. A small, cramped space, monotony, bad air.
Until quite late in the war, U-boats were not true submarines, capable of extended underwater operation. They had to surface often and for lengthy periods. And when they did, they were visible and vulnerable. The Kriegsmarine lost 696 out of the 830 U-boats sent out on operations, and over 70% of all U-boat crews operational between 1939 and 1945. A far greater proportion of active personnel lost than any other service of any combatant nation. According to Dönitz, the loss of a single boat was the price paid for sinking 100,000 tons of Allied shipping. But by May 1943, the value of one boat had become an unacceptably meager 10,000 tons. On May 24th, Dönitz was forced to admit that, for the moment, the battle was lost. The battle would be renewed with improved vessels and weapons, but the initiative was never regained.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the vital logistic battle of the war. Whether it failed or succeeded on either side really determined the course of the war. The turn of the tide was the result of the continuing evolution of the intelligence system. It was the result of the increase in strength of the escort forces. It was the result of technological developments, in particular direction-finding systems, by enabling the North American industrial machine to provide all the resources that were needed to fight what was an industrial war. The Battle of the Atlantic was central.
The home front understood the hardships being endured by those who went to sea. As one rescued sailor discovered,
The journey across London via the Underground, clad in a salt-stained uniform and clutching my orange-coloured life jacket, was more of an ordeal than the whole of the Western Ocean, with masses of people all wanting to crowd around me to slap my back or shake my hand.
the Battle of the Atlantic disrupted supplies to and affected lives on the home front.
Every day before the war, 10 to 15 ships were arriving in British ports bringing food, and that number halved once the war started. Churchill talks about winning the Battle of the Atlantic was the key to winning the war, and in many ways he was right. But it wasn't the key to Britain's ability to feed itself.
In 1938, 68 million tons of imports were landed in Britain. In 1941, the figure was 26 million. Golf courses were ploughed and planted, rationing enforced, ersatz recipes officially distributed. The shipping crisis of 1942 forced legislation in Britain outlawing white bread and introducing a detested beige bread known as the national loaf. Onions were so valued, they were given as prizes in raffles and presents on birthdays. But overall, though the diet of the middle class deteriorated during the war, that of the working class improved.
So the Battle of the Atlantic was crucial, but it never threatened Britain's survival.
But not in occupied Europe, where millions were being starved. On January 30th, 1942, the 9th anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor, Hitler spoke from the stage of the Berlin Sportspalast.
The war will not end as the Jews imagine it will, namely with the uprooting of the Aryans. But the result of this war will be the complete annihilation of the Jews.
Those walled up in ghettos were already fulfilling his prophecy. Moishe Fishman was one of them.
We finished up living 10 to a room. We slept in shifts. Because of the hygienic condition, typhus set in. We had no medicine. Whatever we had to be smuggled. If they found you outside the ghetto without the band, you were a dead person. People were dying right, left, and center. Next were ration cards. You were a German, you received 2,180, I think to be correct, calories, now we are in calories, per day. If you were a Pole, you received 600. If you were Jewish, you received 300. Out of the 300, maybe 180 were edible. The rest you could throw away.
It keeps you just alive, but only just, and eventually you starve to death. Anybody who they considered to be not worthy of life, they employed this strategy of starving them to death.
The Battle of the Atlantic did not mean starvation. It meant shortages and shoddy substitutes. Elsewhere, the disruption of maritime supply lines did mean life or death. If the United Kingdom is an island nation, Japan is a nation of islands.
The Japanese go into the Second World War with America on a very frugal ration already, and it gets worse. So Japan depends on imports from abroad, but it also depends on shipping between the islands. And the American U-boat campaign against Japan is extremely effective.
1 month after Pearl Harbor, on January 7th, 1942, the USS Pollock sunk a Japanese freighter off Tokyo. It was the first of the 1,113 merchant ships sunk by the American submarines. Japan knew it could not win a war of attrition. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, famously told his Prime Minister,
"In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory." But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success.
Within the space of 5 months, Japan created a vast empire. But against fragile opposition. The war against Hitler had weakened an already inadequate defense, resting in the hands of leaders who seem almost to have been designed as caricatures. Boundlessly incompetent, stubbornly racist.
A lot of racial prejudice underlies the Allies' initial reading of what the Japanese military is capable of. And so it underestimates its ability to maneuver. It underestimates simply its ability to fight. Thus, the Japanese are able to wrest control in areas that they're fighting very quickly.
Even in defeat, praise was grudging and tainted. General Archibald Wavell, overall commander-in-chief, called the force that destroyed his command
an army of highly trained gangsters.
Japanese racism was at least as toxic as that of any other country. Of those the invasion set out to conquer, the manual advised soldiers,
"We may wish to make men of them quickly, but we should not expect too much."
Racism was one of the most important explanations for the fact that the Japanese never really were able to work as closely with the Germans as they might have done.
Malaya produced 38% of the world's rubber and almost 60% of its tin. That it was a Japanese target surprised no one. Yet the defenders managed to be surprised. Almost as soon as the fight on the Malay Peninsula started, a Japanese officer concluded,
"The only thing we had to fear were the quantity of munitions and thoroughness of demolitions."
The British forces are seeking to defend the road and rail corridor by fighting on the road and rail corridor. Because if you're a military force and you want to move quickly, that's what you've got to use. They build defensive positions backed up by artillery. What they want to do is stop the Japanese in their tracks, employ the artillery, destroy them.
The British were still seeing everything in terms of roads, and so they were defending roads. The Japanese brilliantly exploited outflanking movements again and again. They found the British had established a blocking position on a road, and they just went round the back, through the jungle. And the moment the British found themselves outflanked, they retreated.
A British officer was eyewitness to the speed of Japan's advance.
Within 2 minutes, a dozen medium tanks passed me. They had crashed right through our forward companies.
General Yamashita, commanding the Japanese invasion force, had 150 tanks. They were not very good tanks, but their quality didn't matter. The British forces opposing him had no tanks.
British and Imperial forces were pretty woefully trained when it came to jungle warfare. The Indian Army, which made up a major proportion of the defenders, were trained essentially for the plains and the hills of India. This would be really useless when it came to fighting on narrow jungle tracks.
Yamashita's men had seen combat in China, but this was their first time fighting in the jungle. One Japanese colonel remarked,
"The enemy retreated, leaving behind as souvenirs about 50 field guns, 50 heavy machine guns, 300 trucks."
Another colonel boasted,
"Owing to the availability of Churchill's supplies, there was no necessity for us to transport even one bag of rice."
Churchill's supplies was the name the Japanese facetiously attached to abandoned Allied supply dumps.
They were told to get Churchill's rations to raid the British soldiers' food dumps and so on. That was always a part of the strategy.
The Japanese soldier was better motivated, better trained, better prepared than his British and Australian counterpart.
Australian troops who fought on the peninsula upheld a proud tradition. One battalion, at the suggestion of its colonel, went into battle singing Waltzing Matilda. Their fight was the Battle of Muar. General Yamashita said,
"The Battle of Muar was the most savage of the whole campaign. In all fairness, the survivors of the enemy forces can feel proud, because in a week-long bloody battle without any tank or air support, they held up the whole of my army."
By the time the Japanese advance reached Singapore Island, it was outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, had been marching for 55 days, and was short of ammunition. And yet, after landing, they rolled over a disorganized force. Many of the Allied troops facing the Japanese invasion were recently arrived and mainly raw recruits. On February 13th, a Japanese English-language broadcast blared over the city, declaring that there will be no Dunkirk at Singapore. Two days later, Arthur Percival wrote in his diary,
"There is no hope or help on the horizon."
There was a kind of a collective collapse in the morale and the confidence of British forces. It was really all over when the Japanese invasion force captured the city's water supply. At that point, it would have been very easy to lay the British forces under siege.
Arthur Percival surrendered his command. His appearance, his dress, his companions, and their carriage of the Union flag could hardly have been improved on by a propagandist wishing to hollow out the reputation of the British Empire. He fitted perfectly the role of scapegoat.
It was a symbol, really, of the fact that the British Empire in the Far East was rotten, it had no substance to it, and it could be taken by a people that Churchill had been apt to despise. It was a disaster and a humiliation that he found it very, very difficult to explain in Parliament.
As an 18-year-old, Lee Kuan Yew, who would be independent Singapore's first Prime Minister, watched the British trudge into their terrible captivity.
I saw them trampling along in front of my house for 3 solid days. An endless stream of bewildered men.
With astonishing, vicious force, the Japs occupy Britain's Gibraltar of the East. 123 years in the making, lost in 7 days.
There were more British and Australian troops in Malaya and later Singapore than there were Japanese. But the Japanese simply outfought them at every turn. And of course, Japanese commanders outcommanded them.
For Singapore and for the prisoners of war, a shocking trial was beginning. It was, Churchill said,
the greatest disaster and capitulation in British history.
He wanted them to lose nobly, gallantly, and he's almost heartbroken after the collapse of Singapore. He said, we had so many men. He said they should have done better. And he was unbelievably distressed by the fact not only that the British Army in Malaya didn't show themselves to be heroes, but they didn't even show themselves to be adequate soldiers. They simply crumpled.
The Japanese view was expressed in the diary of one of its soldiers.
I greet 1942, a year of great significance, with a body and mind as clear and clean as an azure sky. In this year, more than any other, we must fulfill the path of the warrior.
That path would be a crooked one. In every occupied territory, the killing of civilians, for little reason or no reason, started at once.
The Japanese have been fighting the Chinese for a decade, and when they conquer Singapore, who do they turn on? They turn on the Chinese population of Singapore. The Sukching, the great massacre of the Chinese, is the first big tragedy of the Japanese conquest.
Operation Sukching, carried out in Singapore from February 21st to March 4th, targeted 5 categories of Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50. The selection was often arbitrary. At Jalan Besar, one of the screening centers, men who wore glasses are said to have been selected because they were assumed to be educated.
The Japanese military were immensely powerful and had incredibly racist, denigratory attitudes towards the peoples of East Asia, over which they were gradually annexing territory.
Massacre sites included the beaches at Punggol, Changi, Katong, Tanah Merah, and Blakang Mati, now Sentosa Island. Japan admits the outrage and puts the death toll at 5,000. The Singaporean estimate is between 20,000 and 50,000 killed.
What usually happens in a campaign of violence is that you manage to bind different groups of people together around some common ideological or political program so that you can engage in violence on this scale. But there's no one motive, there's no one mindset.
Within days of completing the conquest of Malaya, Japanese forces struck towards the Dutch East Indies and its prize oil fields. There, the critical engagement was at sea, where the Battle of the Java Sea destroyed an Allied fleet, sailing under the Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman. 10 ships and 2,000 men, including Doorman, were sent to the bottom for the loss of 1 Japanese troop transport. The invaders landed. The fight on land lasted a week. Two months earlier, just 3 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had attacked the British colony of Hong Kong. Following a week of aerial bombardment, Japanese envoys crossed Hong Kong Harbor under safe passage with a message for the British governor. Sir Mark Young sent them back with his response.
The governor and commander-in-chief of Hong Kong declines absolutely to enter into negotiations for the surrender of Hong Kong.
It was noble, but it was costly. The following day, under cover of a heavy artillery barrage, Japanese troops landed on Hong Kong Island. In preparing the invasion of Hong Kong, the Japanese commander of the first wave, Colonel Tanaka, told his regiment they were to take no prisoners. They obeyed his order. The colony surrendered in the afternoon, but the atrocities continued. America's presence in the Philippines, it was never called a colony, went back to the 1898 war with Spain. General Douglas MacArthur's father had been its military governor, which is why MacArthur was invited to organize its army. He claimed he had a
tremendously strong offensive and defensive force.
He had 130,000 men in uniform, but 100,000 were Filipinos who were to fight with great courage. But they had been trained in close order drill. They could salute, but not much else.
The Philippines, of course, they knew something was coming, but it was a long time since they'd been at war, and they weren't fully combat-minded until the combat happened.
7.5 hours after Pearl Harbor, the first attack hit Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines. Destroying on the ground 86 of the 160 American aircraft on the island. The main landing on Luzon established 43,110 men of the Japanese 14th Army ashore. MacArthur reported,
"My gallant divisions are holding ground and denying the foe the sacred soil of the Philippines."
It wasn't true. A second landing threatened Manila, which was declared an open city, but the convention was not observed. Filipinos who failed to bow 3 times to Japanese soldiers were hanged in public places. MacArthur left Manila for Corregidor. On January 1st, Allied forces completed their withdrawal to Bataan. On the 22nd, MacArthur ordered withdrawal to the final defensive line, and on the 24th, cabled Washington.
"I intend to fight it out to complete destruction."
But Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to transfer his headquarters to Australia, and on March 11th, he was evacuated by submarine. A poem written in a Japanese POW camp gave voice to the thoughts of some, perhaps not all, of those he commanded. The 9th, Major General King, asking his opposite number,
"Let him go, let him go. We are the braver. Stain his hands with our blood, dye them forever. Recall, O ye kinsmen, how he left us to die, starved and insulted by his infamous lie."
Following a bombing campaign, the final Japanese offensive on Bataan opened on April 3rd. Allied forces surrendered on the 9th. General Major King, asking his opposite number,
"Will our troops be well treated?"
"We are not barbarians."
They were. The 78,000 taken prisoner were to be marched more than 100 kilometers into captivity under the scorching sun, with hardly any food or water. This was the Bataan Death March. Filipino deaths on the march are estimated as high as 18,000. More than 600 of the 12,000 Americans on the death march died. Barely a third of those who survived were alive at the end of the war. 3.5% of the Allied prisoners of Germany died in captivity. The toll for Allied prisoners of the Japanese was almost 10 times that figure. In America, civilians of Japanese heritage were victims of discrimination and unfair treatment. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, aimed, it said, at preventing espionage on American shores, authorized the evacuation of all persons considered a threat from the West Coast to internment camps further inland. The order did not specify any ethnic group, but curfews were announced that applied only to Japanese Americans. Then, on March 29, 1942, under the authority of the executive order, Lieutenant General John L.W. DeWitt issued Public Proclamation No. 4, which began the forced evacuation and detention of West Coast residents of Japanese American ancestry. Those interned were given 48 hours' notice. Unless they were able to dispose of or make arrangements for their property within that time, their homes, businesses, and private belongings were lost forever. Between March and August, around 112,000 people, nearly 70,000 of them born in America, were sent to army-style barracks. None faced charges of disloyalty, and there was no means by which they could appeal their loss of property and personal liberty. 10 different internment camps were established many miles inland, mostly in desolate locales. In the camps, families with the clothing and possessions they could carry with them lived until the end of the war. But that was 3 years away. On May 5th, just 10 weeks after Roosevelt signed Order 9066, Japanese forces landed on Corregidor after a bombardment of 16,000 shells. On the 6th, General Wainwright sent a cable.
With profound regret and continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander. Goodbye, Mr. President.
He then surrendered his garrison on Mindanao. On the 16th, General William Sharp surrendered the last of the Allied forces and brought the Philippines campaign to an end. Germany had launched its assault on the Soviet Union. At the end of the year, Japan swept across East Asia and the Pacific. In the early months of 1942, the Allies confronted two vast empires that had been created with unimaginable speed. And then, less than 3 weeks after General Sharp's surrender, the US Pacific and Imperial Japanese fleets met at Midway. By the end of 1942, in North Africa, in Russia, in the Pacific, the whole direction of the war had been reversed.